Hey guys, what is up? Public here, back with another video, and today we have quite a lot of changes to talk about. In the next coming patch reset this week, we're getting lots of changes to Shadow Priest, lots of buffs to Shadow Priest specifically, and you can tell these are definitely targeted at Voidweaver specifically, although Archon builds did get a little bit as well. So in this video, I'm going to kind of go over the early information as far as we know as how this is going to change builds, what this looks like for playing Shadow Priest in Season 1 of the War Within. Let's dive in. Alright, so if you haven't already seen it, there is a blog post that I've put up on the Book of Shadows site. We haven't really used this much in the past, but trying to use it a bit more. This is going to kind of go over all of the meat and potatoes of what's actually changed and some of the early stuff that we've seen so far. The reason why I say early stuff is things are just still being tested. There's quite a lot of changes here that takes a while for us to feel confident about what has changed. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is definitely kind of an early bit of what we've seen so far, but I would expect some small things to change as we move forward, particularly as we find more optimizations within the rotation or gearing and that sort of thing. So with that being said, let's kind of dive into what we see so far. We'll start off with just the changes in general. So if you haven't actually seen the list of changes that are coming with the weekly reset, so if you're on NA, it's the October 8th. If EU is, it's the 9th. So we have quite a lot of changes here. Some of these apply to both Archon and Voidweaver, and we have some that are Voidweaver specific. So Mind Blast, Shadow or Death, Void Bolt, and Shadowy Apparitions are all buffed by 10%. So just straight up buffing just those spells, which, more or less makes sense. You could tell that these spells were kind of underperforming relative to other parts of our kit. If you look at Archon in particular, Mind Flay Insanity was just so far and above everything else. I think this is really just about closing that gap there with these spells that, we were pressing, but you didn't really get much value out of compared to those spells. The other guys are with Voidweaver. So Voidweaver buffed Entropic Rift damage by 10%, Void Blast by 20%, Collapsing Void and Void Wraith by 10%, and then Inner Quietus was also buffed from 20% to 25%. So if you didn't know, Inner Quietus does the kind of increased dot damage of Vampiric Touch and Shadow Pain. That modifier went from 20 to 25%. So, like I said, definitely a lot more Voidweaver specific buffs here, which makes sense. The Voidweaver was kind of laggy behind a little bit in more or less all cases, and even more so inside of high push key Mythic Plus scenarios that we were testing. Though I think this was still Voidweaver was competitive before, just was never hitting that threshold of being better, but it was always close. I mean, even in raid builds, we were seeing 1 to 2% and that kind of thing. So just kind of frame of reference, what do these buffs actually mean in terms of context of overall damage. Archon got about 3%. Voidweaver, this is going to be between 5 and 7%, and the reason why it's a range is because of build changes. There are some build implications with this, but depending on what you change and what you don't change, you can expect a 5 to 7% bump here on Voidweaver single target. And then from an AoE perspective, Archon builds got about 2% damage, and then Voidweaver got about 4% damage, again, depending on the builds that we are changing. The reason why I'm talking about builds and why this is a little hard to talk about is because compared to the previous changes where they just did aura buffs to say, hey, this spell does 4%, all of your spells do 4% more damage or 6% more damage. When they buff specific spells, this changes the ratio between what certain talents do or don't do for the build, which can have build implications. In particular, Voidweaver, we saw a bit more changes than what Archon would see. Early testing doesn't see that Archon's going to change its build whatsoever, but Voidweaver definitely has some more options than we've seen in the past, which has been impacting things. So let's go over the exact overview of what these changes actually mean. All right, so at a high level, there are 3 big points that I want to kind of cover of before we dive into when to pick Archon versus Voidweaver. So first off, Unfurling Darkness is now a strongly preferred talent for Voidweaver builds in non-dungeon, non-Mythic Plus environments. This was kind of a surprising change that we'd noticed. We were just kind of randomly testing some things. Someone actually posted a question in the Discord, and we started investigating this. Shout out to Sailor for doing all that work. And basically, Unfurling Darkness is really strong with Voidweaver in particular. One of the reasons it's strong, baseline, you can see in the tooltip, it deals 305% spell power. I think Mind Blast spell power coefficient is 75% or 80% or something like that. So this thing hits really hard. Now, obviously, you do have to press Vampiric Touch twice, once to cast, once for the instant to get this damage off, but it is quite nice. And what we actually noticed is, with Inner Quietus in particular, which, if you don't remember, Inner Quietus is a thing that increases Vamp Touch and Shadow Pain damage, this modifier does affect Unfurling Darkness, as well as a couple other modifiers in the kit. Sadly, Dark Ascension does not buff Unfurling Darkness damage, which is sad. Been that way forever. But what we notice is this one talent point can actually really help with the build, particularly in single target. And it also gives us something to rely on from like a dot refresh perspective. You know, because Voidweaver prefers playing Dark Ascension, it doesn't have Void Bolt, so getting that like dot refreshing is part of the build. But since Voidweaver doesn't play around Mindflay Insanity or Mindspike Insanity like Archon does, the Mental Decay refresh wasn't quite as valuable because we weren't pressing these spells that often, and we were kind of ended up having to eventually manually redot anyways. So Unfurling Darkness kind of shores that up by, yes, you're still going to have to manually cast Vampiric Touch to refresh your dots, but when you're doing so, you also get an instant cast global that hits really hard that you can press within 7-8 seconds afterwards that. So we're seeing that, you know, the single target builds for Voidweaver in particular really like this talent. We are seeing it fall off as you add targets. So like when you hit like 3, 4, 5 targets, it's really kind of doing less and less. Obviously, it's just a single target hit. It can, you know, make multi-dotting slightly easier, but that doesn't make up for all the other things that other talents will give you during that space. Notably, right, like Vampiric Touch isn't going to be replicated by Psychic Link and that kind of thing. So it doesn't really scale with AoE, but it does make the build end up doing really well in single target. So a lot of you probably are not used to playing this talent. Maybe you've been PvPing or you tried it while leveling, but this is kind of a core staple of the big changes for Voidweaver. Roughly speaking, this is a 2% gain on single target from Voidweaver build. So if you don't take Unfurling Darkness on Voidweaver to taking Unfurling Darkness, you're getting an extra 2% overall damage in single target, which is massive. So basically, if you're playing Voidweaver single target, you should pick Unfurling Darkness. The other thing we changed, which is important to talk about, is with the way SimC handles Entropic Rift. So a bit of context here, you know, the way that we modeled Entropic Rift inside of Sims is basically when Entropic Rift spawns in the sim, it's going to hit all targets all the time, basically. It doesn't account for targets being placed differently and the rift kind of starting out small and growing bigger. We've tried various different ways of modeling this, and unfortunately, SimC just doesn't do a whole lot of, you know, great job supporting the way that targets move in a real-world environment. So we kind of just made that assumption. It always hits everything, every single tick. Obviously, now that Voidweaver is more competitive, we realized that we couldn't just put this out in the wild with the way that it was today, because it was a little disingenuous to how it actually plays in-game, with obviously the rift being centered around a target, and then, you know, depending on where targets are positioned, you might miss some casts or ticks of it, or if bosses are moving, you're going to miss ticks as well. Again, SimC doesn't really handle modeling this super well. What we decided to do to kind of tackle this, it's not perfect, but it at least gives us something, is by adding miss percent to Entropic Rift ticks. So basically what this means is ticks of Entropic Rift per target have a chance to miss inside of SimC. So even in a single target, there's a 5% chance for the ticks of Entropic Rift to just straight up miss and not cast. You'll actually be able to see that in your breakdown in the sim. If you're curious, it'll actually be flagged as a miss versus a hit or a crit. And then above 2 targets, that chance is increased to 10%. We can tweak these. There's a sim option that you can use to make this more or less aggressive. You know, this is, you know, borderline like 0.3% DPS loss on single target. That's like 1% in change in AoE. The reason, again, we did this is to make things a bit more realistic, to kind of go through like, well, yeah, theoretically, if it hits all targets, it's good, but in reality, that's never going to happen. So we did this to kind of make up for that fact. Obviously, depending on the situation, this could be highballing or lowballing how much the miss percent is, but the idea is here it should make it more accurate. We might make this a bit more sophisticated in the future, but this is what we're using for now. Now, the last thing I wanted to note is that Voidweaver will still naturally struggle as you go into dungeons and start pulling massive packs. You know, anything more than 8 targets, Voidweaver's, you know, even at 8 targets, Voidweaver is struggling. You just don't have the sustain of Void Bolt more than anything to kind of keep you through things. And even if you do take Void Eruption for whatever reason, you're just not able to get anywhere near what Archon can get in terms of burst, and we'll cover that in just a second. So from a pushing keys perspective, you're still going to prefer playing Archon, particularly when pulls start lasting like a minute plus, or you're chain pulling packs together, pulling more than 8 targets at a time, that kind of thing. Archon's still going to do really, really well in those situations. It's going to be nice and consistent as well. But on the other hand, inside of Mythic Plus, if you're pulling like one pack at a time type dungeons, you're never going more than 8 targets. Things are only living like 30 seconds, which is Voidweaver's kind of sweet spot angle. Voidweaver is going to do really well. And again, also, if you've been playing Mythic Plus this past week, I know I tweeted about it. We were still kind of testing some stuff with the Voidbound affix, where it summons an enemy that's in execute range and has a shield. Voidweaver is just cranking with Devour Matter in particular, because you do get the Psychic Link benefit from that. So I think on Voidbound weeks in particular, you could make the case for, Voidweaver can push past 10 keys if you want. But more or less, usually that's not going to be the case. All right, so I said kind of a lot already, but I do want to kind of break this down quite simply into when to pick Archon, when to pick Voidweaver. Strictly speaking, Archon and Voidweaver are both very competitive inside of raiding. If you're playing, Shadow Priest inside of a raid, you should feel free to play whichever style fits you the best. There are certain bosses that might lean more towards one versus the other, and we'll talk about that. But generally speaking, I think from a viability perspective or competitiveness standpoint, either build's going to be good from a raiding perspective. Now, Mythic Plus is going to be a little different and really just depends on the key level, your group, what you're looking for. I think for the vast majority of players, you can make either one of these work. The question is, when you start going past 10 keys and really in like 11, 12s, and where the kind of damage gets kind of nuts, I think that's where Archon's really still going to kind of take over. But we're still testing. I'm still curious to see what people are going to see, especially on non-Voidbound affix weeks. But generally speaking, that's the guidance. So a lot better than it has been in the past. Very competitive in raids. Dungeons for most people. Voidweaver is also still very competitive. Play what you prefer. Now, more specifically, when to pick Archon, I think if you're looking for consistency, Archon's really there for consistency. It's always going to do really, really well. The reason why I say that is it's not really dominated by procs in the same way that Voidweaver can be, and it doesn't have the same kind of contingencies with targets moving around, right? When you're playing Archon, Halo has this massive range. Mind Flay Insanity is a big portion of your damage, and it's always going to hit, assuming that you're, casting the spell and not moving during the channel. And that's a really big benefit for Archon. So on certain fights, like Princess, things like that, where the boss is moving around quite a lot, or Sickran, where the boss is moving around quite a lot, your Rift is just going to look really silly while it's moving and trying to follow the target. Obviously, there's some degree that you can play around with this, but the problem is Voidweaver really can't afford to hold Void Torrent hardly at all. You really just need to slam that guy on cooldown. So if mechanics are overlapping where that won't work, it's going to suffer. Archon just doesn't have that problem, which is nice. The other thing I'll say with Archon is it does prefer the Void Eruption playstyle. The reason why I call this out from a playstyle perspective is more or less because of Void Bolt. Void Bolt just gives you so much more freedom. You just get a lot more instant cast to pre-plan your movement with, and Voidweaver just doesn't have this. Yes, the Voidweaver does get cast while moving Void Torrent, but the amount of instant cast you get with pressing Void Bolt so often inside of cooldowns, Archon just has more mobility, just straight up. That can be a really big advantage depending on the fight that you're playing with. Keep that in mind. And the last thing I already kind of mentioned from a Mythic Plus perspective, if you're pushing high key levels, packs are living long, you're chaining packs together, specifically you're pulling around your cooldowns, Archon's going to be night and day better than Voidweaver. Obviously, this can get kind of tough when you're in like a pug situation, but in like coordinated groups, Archon should still shine far and beyond what Voidweaver will do on most weeks. Again, caveat being Voidbound. So, moving on to when to pick Voidweaver, basically the opposite of what I just said. If you want top single target damage, Voidweaver is technically where it's going to be from. Now, obviously this is contingent on things not moving out of Entropic Rift, and you're playing Unfurling Darkness. If you don't like playing Unfurling Darkness, which I get it, it's not going to be for everyone, Archon's going to net you more single target damage. But if you're willing to weave Unfurling Darkness into the build with Voidweaver, you can get really good results with this, and even theoretically better than Archon. Upwards of 1%, right? So it's not like it's a crazy amount, but if you're looking for that hyper optimal playstyle, this is what it's going to do. Now, this does prefer the Dark Ascension playstyle. From a rating perspective, we don't really get a whole lot of benefit from this, although inside of Mythic Plus, this does mean you have more damage windows than Archon currently has. So Archon does damage basically on its 1 minute for Halos and it's off cooldown, and then every 2 minutes. Voidweaver also does big damage every 2 minutes with Power Infusion, but you still have the 1 minute window with Dark Ascension, and you have a 30-second window with Void Torrent. So you basically have good damage every 30 seconds, whereas Archon's basically every minute. So you do get more windows of damage with Voidweaver. In rating, less of a big deal, although this could make sense depending on certain fight timings as well, where, if the fight is kind of an awkward length of like a minute and a half or, 3 minutes, 30 seconds, right? Where like you're not getting your second use of cooldowns or like the third use, whatever it is, Voidweaver could make more sense because you're getting that better off window of damage before PI comes back. Like I said, for Mythic Plus Dungeons, if you're just pulling one pack at a time, very common in Pug Keys, or honestly, like certain dungeons just have to be pulled one pack at a time. Like Dawnbreaker is a pretty good example here. Things like that, where like you really can't chain pull very much just with the cadence of the dungeon. Voidweaver is going to do much better in those cases. As soon as you start like chaining packs together, or the packs themselves are living like 60 seconds plus, that's where Voidweaver will start to struggle. Now, one big thing I want to mention is, and I've already said this a couple times, Xal'atath's Bargain Voidbound Affix is really, really good for Voidweaver. The reason why it's so good, periodically throughout the dungeon, every minute or so, it spawns an ad that has just a massive shield that has 0 health. This gives a double benefit for Voidweaver. Because we play with Devour Matter, you always get this. You get this massive shield breaker here, and if you have like a Death Speaker proc, whatever else, it just deals massive amounts of damage to this ad. With Death and Madness, you get 2 Shadow Word Deaths if it's available, because it is technically in Execute. And the coolest part about this, from like an overall damage perspective, this all works with Psychic Link. So all of these hits do massive damage to the entire group, assuming it's dotted. And you're just an Affix killer, which is great, and it's good utility for the group. So if you're playing Shadow Priest and Mythic Plus, even above a 10, if you can make good use out of this, I can see it actually being better than Archon in some of those cases. But again, kind of group dependent. If you already have a good way of killing these ads, maybe not as good. But for most people, it's going to feel really, really nice. All right, I covered this a little bit, but just to go over specifically what's changing from a rotation perspective. Again, we are still testing this stuff out. Some of this might change. There's a couple highlights that I wanted to kind of throw out there of like what's actually different here. I'm not covering over like what Voidweaver does differently than Archon. I have done Voidweaver rotation videos in the past. I will probably end up re-recording that in the future now that we have some changes here. But at a high level, this is what's changing going into this next patch. And almost all of this is just for Voidweaver. So first off, with Voidweaver, we have talked in the past about pooling Mind Blasts before we actually go into Void Torrent. So with this, we pool for 1 GCD with Mind Flay builds, or 2 GCDs with Mind Spike, meaning we do not press Mind Blast within 1 or 2 GCDs before we press Void Torrent with Voidweaver. The reason why we do this is just to make sure we can fit as many Void Blasts in as possible. We get more value out of doing that with Mind Spike builds than we do with Flay builds, although it is kind of close. This is just like kind of rough guidelines. We'll go over some like ways to track this in just a minute. Next up is with Unfurling Darkness. So you should cast Vampiric Touch to spend Unfurling Darkness procs, meaning you have the buff ready for big damage at quite high priority. This is just below Void Bolt, but above Surge of Insanity, Void Torrent, or Mind Blast. Obviously, Voidweaver doesn't take Void Bolt, so I should probably reword this, but it's a very high priority. Once you have Unfurling Darkness buff, you need to spend it quickly. The buff only lasts 8 seconds, so pretty much whenever you're going to spend time to generate the proc of Unfurling Darkness, you immediately spend it. So you just go Vampiric Touch immediately afterwards. So for actually generating Unfurling Darkness with Vampiric Touch, when you're facing less than 6 targets, Dark Ascension is not active. You do this right above normal Mind Blast in the priority list. So it's not like a true filler. You are pressing it over Mind Blast. Again, Mind Blast is kind of weak, and it kind of helps with pooling anyways. As long as you're not inside of cooldowns, this is generally speaking when you do this, should line up naturally with dot refreshing as well. And that's kind of the idea here. And the last thing I'll mention, we did kind of tweak the way that we use Devouring Plague. This was more or less for Archon more than anything, but Voidweaver gets this as well. We were kind of in the past saying, well, at a low priority, you could kind of full send Insanity during cooldowns. This is still mostly true, but for Voidweaver, we've changed that to be while Dark Ascension is active to while Entropic Rift is active. Basically, Voidweaver builds don't get as much value out of like full sending its Insanity during Dark Ascension if Entropic Rift is not active during that time. So while you're in that case, you basically kind of, while Entropic Rift is active, you can kind of full send Devouring Plague at lower priorities than other things. And then once Entropic Rift falls off, if Dark Ascension is still active, you basically fall back to only using Devouring Plague if it's about to expire or you're about to cap on Insanity like you would normally in the other parts of our rotation. Okay, briefly let's kind of go over what this opener actually looks like when you're playing Voidweaver with this build. Now, in general, because of Unfurling Darkness and a couple other things, we've actually dropped off Idol of Yasharaj and Inescapable Torment as being required for this build. There are still variants that are competitive with that, but by default, we've chosen to remove that just because it's not giving you a whole lot for the extra complexity that it's adding into the rotation, especially now that we've added Unfurling Darkness as just another thing to kind of keep in mind and maintain. So with this, what does the kind of example opener look like with that kind of default build as we have it right now? With Voidweaver, so you cast Halo pre-pull for 10 Insanity. We're no longer using this for damage like we do with Archon, so we can afford to use this pre-pull since it doesn't actually expire that Insanity, to start off with 10. The reason why we do this is we need to get that Devouring Plague at the right amount of time. And then you open with Vampiric Touch. This procs Unfurling Darkness, and then you immediately press Vampiric Touch again to consume Unfurling Darkness. And then, unfortunately, with the way that Insanity Generation has worked out, we do have to press one Mind Spike here, and then go into Void Wraith, and then we can do Dark Ascension Powered Infusion with Tempered Potion. Again, the reason we have to do all of this, especially this awkward little Mind Spike right here, is because we want to press Devouring Plague the second we get into Dark Ascension, and because we're taking Destroyed Reality with this build here, we do need that extra bit here. So it does make the opener more awkward in that sense, but it gives you more room to actually fit these things in the rotation by being able to do Devouring Plague, Void Torrent, double Void Blast before having to actual refresh Devouring Plague. Otherwise, with Mind's Eye, you'd have to weave in Devouring Plague here. That's the ideal opener. You know, there are some complexities there, but this is the simple idea with this if you want to try it out yourself. Okay, now, I did kind of mention this earlier, but just to call out, I did, make two specific weak auras here to help you play this a little bit better. So the first one is a Pooling Mind Blast helper. This is a really simple weak aura that just simply tells you to pool Mind Blast based on the changes that we said before. By default right now, it does 1 GCD before Void Torrent with Mind Flay builds and 2 GCDs with Mind Spike builds. You can tweak this in the custom options, but that's what that's for, simple text weak aura. There's also an Unfurling Darkness one. This is like an all-around Vampiric Touch tracker, so it tracks the dot, tracks the buff, tells you when it's ready to press, and kind of the duration on the buff and the debuff there. So this is, available to you if you don't already have this built in somewhere. And I will say these are both baked into my weak aura set if you're already using it. All of these changes are already in there. Okay, this is probably what a lot of people are looking out for. I've saved this for the end just because this is the part where things are the most fuzzy. So we're still tweaking this stuff, but I want to kind of showcase what this looks like if you haven't already seen. So inside, these are just kind of example breakdowns inside of Sims. I'll kind of go over them one by one. So starting off with single target. Now I will mention this single target does include a little bit of movement here to try to make it more realistic. But as you can see here, the rough game that you can go from Archon to Voidweaver is up to 1%. Obviously, this build at the top and all of these Voidweaver builds are all using Unfurling Darkness. As I mentioned before, if you don't want to play Unfurling Darkness, it's going to be worse than Archon by, 1% give or take, or, within 1% of Archon, but lower the other way. Keep that in mind. Now with these, again, we prefer to drop Yasharaj, play Mind Spike with Destroyed Reality. As you can see, playing Yasharaj with Mind Flay with Destroyed Reality or Mind's Eye is pretty close. So if you do prefer to play with these builds, these are technically an option, although I think for most people, they would prefer not to play with that kind of Inescapable Torment gameplay. That's totally up to you. Obviously, it is very, very close depending on what you're trying to do. You're talking about like 3,000 DPS, right? Like not that big of a deal, but you have to weave in Shadow or Deaths now into the rotation, which does add a bit more to things. Obviously, Archon is still here. If you want to see what these builds look like, we'll kind of showcase these real quick. So with Voidweaver single target, it looks really similar to what we're playing already, although we are now taking Mind Spike and Unfurling Darkness. Most of the stuff in the bottom row should look pretty familiar to most of you guys if you've already been playing Archon. This is generally speaking what that looks like for Voidweaver. Again, Archon build, very similar to what we've been playing already. Nothing is really changing here. Looks just like this. You should be pretty used to this. Nothing is different. If you want to see what the kind of Mind Flay builds look like with Yasharaj, with Voidweaver, looks something like this. This is what I believe the guides already have. The only difference is we now have Unfurling Darkness into the build now, which is new. Okay, now if we move on to 2 target stacked, I include this mostly because second to last boss is 2 target. Now the caveat here is this is a stack sim, and inside the fight, the bosses are not always stacked. They do have some portion of single target as well. I just kind of showed this to kind of give an example of how things look. Obviously, I think most people are going to suggest running the single target builds here anyways, but just to kind of show you potential with these builds in 2 target, these are the best 2 target builds pulled out of here. things are a little different. You can notice specifically the Voidweaver build ends up dropping Void Wraith for Depth of Shadows. This is actually particularly nice on ad fights anyways, because you can kind of, snipe those Shadow or Death casts. Unfurling Darkness as well is actually kind of nice here. It gives you, while you're refreshing dots on targets, especially as they're spread, this is a really nice feature as well. Archon, of course, actually could play Yogg-Saron, although we usually don't suggest that because they're not always fully stacked to get the full value out of Yogg. You can see it almost always we just end up playing this build or some combination of this. You can choose to play Maddening Touch or Shadow Crash here. Doesn't really matter. This is pretty similar, bog standard to what we've been running before. You just kind of get that option here with Shadow Crash or not. Totally depends on you. I can see both, honestly. I usually play Shadow Crash, but up to you. You can see from like a damage perspective, you can get like 1.5% more damage with Voidweaver here when they're fully stacked. And then when it's just pure single target, you just get that 1% gain here. Now, you do have to also factor in on this fight, there is a lot of movement in here. So Voidweaver might struggle because it is a bit more planted than Archon can be, since you don't have things like Void Bolt. But if you can make it work, you might see good results with this. Obviously, that boss also has a shield as well during some of those intermissions, where you can get pretty good value out of Devour Matter as well. So I'd say it's definitely viable. If it's like concretely better, hard to say. We need to test it some more, but it is there if you want it. Now, moving into composite raids. So what composite raid is for is it's kind of throwing in a bunch of different things like movement, ads, different amount of targets, that kind of thing, to give a bit more realistic bout of like what's doing what. You can see here with this, Yashiraj does look a little bit better than dropping it completely. Obviously, again, that comes with a bit more complexity there with weaving and Shadow or Death, like I mentioned before. They're all very close, between each other. And this all goes to show, if you want to play Archon in raids, play Archon. If you want to play Voidweaver in raids, play Voidweaver. I suspect we're going to see rank 1 parses with both talent trees at this point. So play whatever you think feels best for you in a raiding environment. That's the big takeaway here. The last one I have is 8 target 1 minute burst. As you can see, Archon is just dominating here when it comes to 8 target 1 minute burst compared to Voidweaver. You can see Voidweaver even wants to take Void Eruption because it knows how strong it is in this kind of environment. Even, with all things being said, just the value you're getting from Void Bolt, not only with refreshing, but all the other things that Void gets with the mastery benefit, all that good stuff. You see Dark Ascension is about 6% behind even that build here. I don't think Voidweaver taking Void Form is viable in like a dungeon scenario. This is just kind of showing like AoE burst potential, and you can see this is why we keep saying Archon at high keys is still going to be the go-to, because of how massive this increase is with Triple Idol or with Hybrid. This is the Hybrid build. This is Triple Idol. So that's why I still think that's going to happen. Now, all that being said, we are doing dungeon route sims. We have every dungeon being sent at a plus 15 level to kind of show what that might look like. These take a really long time to run. It's currently a work in progress. I will eventually update this page with tables here, but just know I don't have that raw data for you right now. All right, so this is all, again, I just want to clarify, this is work in progress. We're still working on this kind of stuff, but I wanted to give a bit of a preview of what these changes are going to look like playing a Shadow Priest in Season 1. I'm hoping to get this video out sooner rather than later, but hopefully it don't take too long editing this. And then the Icy Veins guide throughout the week will be updated with these changes. I have a lot of things I need to test and retest with all the things that have changed. Stat priority, trinkets, you name it. We're going to do everything all over again. This takes us quite a lot of time. So my goal is for this week is to get the written guides up to date as soon as I can. Hopefully by Tuesday, Wednesday. We'll see how long it takes me. And then once things are a bit more stable, the plan is to re-record and get new videos out for things like rotation and full guides for Season 1 after these changes have come out. Let me know what you're interested to see video-wise in there. Should I do like Archon as its own video, Voidweaver as its own video, cover both Raid and Mythic Plus? Do I do 4 videos? What would be most interesting to you guys? Really interested on the feedback for these things. There's a lot coming up here. But yeah, that's all we have in this video. Big thanks to everyone that watches. Big thanks to the folks that support me on YouTube. If you didn't know, members get to watch these videos a day early if you're interested. I don't post that often, but when I do, it's there. And as always, big thanks to the folks on Patreon, Twitch subscribers. Can't talk. You get the idea. Thanks so much for watching. Catch you next time.